In a mansion where the shine blinds, a maid becomes the target of laughter. Expensive dresses, twisted looks, glasses chiming like a sentence. She lowers her eyes, but her hands don't shake. Amid flower arrangements and poisonous whispers, the millionaire watches, silent, until he decides to cut the music of mockery. He walks over, a faint smile, and does something no one expects, not even her. The room holds its breath. Those who humiliate taste their own poison. Those who serve discover the weight of their own worth. And suddenly, the party changes owners. What happens when a single gesture shifts all the power? Before you hear this beautiful story, subscribe to our channel to get heartwarming stories every day. Valerie Brooks woke at 5:30, as she always did, before the traffic began its crawl up Sunset Boulevard. The apartment in Echo Park was small, one bedroom she had given to her grandmother while she slept on the pull-out couch. But the morning light came through clean windows, and the air smelled of the jasmine someone had planted years ago in the courtyard below. She moved quietly, filling the electric kettle, measuring pills into the weekly organizer. Her grandmother sometimes forgot to check. Friday's medication sat in its compartment, the small white tablets that cost more than Valerie made in 2 days of work. She counted the cash in the envelope taped inside the kitchen drawer. Enough for this week's copay at the community clinic in Silver Lake, where her grandmother received treatment for the tremor that had begun in her hands and spread slowly to her legs. The neurologist had been kind but clear. The medication helped, but it would not cure. It would cost, and it would cost more as time went on. Valerie resealed the envelope and washed her hands in water that ran cold, then warm, then scalding. She did not flinch. By 6:15, she was dressed in the black pants and white shirt required for work at the mansion in Beverly Hills, her hair pulled back, her face bare, except for the faint shadows under her eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to erase. Her grandmother was still asleep, her breathing shallow and steady, and Valerie stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the rise and fall of the blanket, before she locked the door and walked down 3 flights to the street. The bus came late, as it often did, and she stood at the stop with a janitor heading to Brentwood, a nanny going to Pacific Palisades, a line cook returning from a graveyard shift downtown. They did not speak. The city woke around them in stages, first the birds, then the delivery trucks, then the hum of freeway traffic in the distance, an endless river of people going somewhere. At the mansion, Valerie checked inventory before anyone else arrived. The dinner that night would host 20 guests, heiresses and consultants and columnists who wrote about society events with the gravity some people reserved for war. She reviewed the schedule, adjusted the timing for each course, and left on the marble counter a notebook filled with cost analyses and the efficiency proposal she had been refining for months. Her system worked because it was simple. Assign tasks by priority, track hours transparently, and eliminate waste without eliminating care. She worked methodically because she needed predictability, and predictability meant her grandmother's medication arrived on time. Andrew Sterling, the host and owner of the mansion, entered the kitchen at 7:40, already dressed in the kind of suit that did not announce its price but assumed you knew it anyway. He scanned the room, nodded at Valerie, and said only, "Tonight matters." She nodded back, understanding that whatever test this evening held, it had nothing to do with the flowers or the crystal. It had to do with people and how they treated those who served them. By noon, the mansion had transformed. White roses lined the entrance hall, their scent heavy and sweet, almost medicinal. The dining room gleamed under chandeliers that caught every surface and multiplied the light until the room felt less like a space for eating and more like a stage. Valerie directed the staff with small gestures, a nod toward the buffet station, a raised hand to pause the silver service. She had trained them to work in near silence, to anticipate without crowding, to disappear when necessary, and materialize when needed. Lorraine Sterling arrived first, as was her custom, dressed in navy silk that rustled when she moved. She was Andrew's mother, a woman who had spent 40 years defending a particular vision of elegance, one that confused hierarchy with grace. She swept through the rooms, touching surfaces that were already clean, repositioning napkins that were already straight, finding fault in arrangements the florist had left only an hour before. When she saw Valerie standing near the pantry door, clipboard in hand, she did not acknowledge her with words, only with a glance that measured and dismissed in the same instant. Kayla Hart arrived 20 minutes later, her phone already raised, filming the entrance, the flowers, the light. She was a travel and wellness influencer with 2 million followers who watched her move through luxury resorts and private villas, documenting a life built on access. She wore white linen and carried a designer bag that cost more than Valerie's rent, and when she spotted Lorraine near the dining table, she kissed the air beside her cheek and said something that made the older woman smile. Valerie observed from the hallway, noting the way Lorraine straightened when Kayla entered, the way both women scanned the room as if cataloging every detail for later judgment. They spoke in low voices, their words blurred by distance, but Valerie caught fragments. The help, standards, not what it used to be. She tightened her grip on the clipboard and returned to the kitchen, where the sous chef was plating appetizers, each one identical, each one perfect. The other guests arrived in clusters, couples who owned galleries in West Hollywood, a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, a former actress who now curated charity auctions. They filled the space with laughter that sounded practiced, with compliments that hovered between sincerity and performance. Andrew greeted them at the door, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, playing the role he had been groomed to play since childhood. But Valerie noticed the tightness around his mouth, the way his eyes tracked Lorraine and Kayla as they circulated through the room. At 6 o'clock, the maitre d' asked Valerie to check the table settings one final time. She moved through the dining room, adjusting a fork, straightening a glass, her hands steady even as Lorraine followed behind her, undoing her work. "No, like this," Lorraine murmured, shifting a napkin a quarter inch to the left. "Symmetry, dear. Symmetry." Valerie said nothing, only nodded and moved to the next place setting, where Lorraine followed again, a shadow with opinions. The humiliation began small, in gestures so minor they could be mistaken for preference. Lorraine summoned Valerie to the foyer, pointed to a vase of white roses, and declared the arrangement unbalanced. The florist, a woman who had worked weddings and funerals for 30 years, had placed the flowers according to Andrew's specifications, but Lorraine wanted them moved 3 inches to the right, then back to the left, then forward, then back again, until Valerie understood the exercise had nothing to do with aesthetics. It had to do with control. Kayla joined in, her phone angled to capture the commotion without filming Lorraine directly. She posted to her story, "Behind the scenes at a multi-million-dollar estate, even the staff needs supervision." The caption floated over a blurred image of Valerie adjusting the vase for the 4th time, her expression neutral, her hands efficient. Within minutes, the post had collected hundreds of likes, dozens of comments praising Kayla for keeping it real. In the kitchen, one of the servers, a young woman named Mia, who had been hired 2 weeks earlier, dropped 2 drops of sauce on a guest's appetizer plate. It was a mistake any trainee might make, invisible to most, but Lorraine saw it happen. She did not speak to Mia. Instead, she summoned Valerie to the dining room, her voice loud enough to carry over the murmur of conversation. "Your staff needs better training," Lorraine said, her tone sharp as glass. "This kind of carelessness is unacceptable." Valerie looked at the plate, saw the 2 barely visible dots of balsamic reduction, and nodded. "I'll address it," she said, her voice even. She took the plate back to the kitchen, reassured Mia with a quiet word, and plated a replacement herself. She did not explain to Lorraine that Mia was still in her probationary period, that the training protocol Valerie had designed specifically accounted for minor errors, that perfection was a process, not a starting point. Explanations were not what Lorraine wanted. The guests, seated now, barely noticed the exchange, absorbed as they were in their own conversations, their own performances. but Andrew noticed. He sat at the head of the table, his hands folded, his face unreadable, and when Valerie returned from the kitchen with the corrected plate, his eyes followed her. She felt the weight of his gaze, but did not meet it. She had learned, over months of working in this house, that Andrew Sterling saw more than he revealed, and tonight, she suspected, he was watching everyone. Back in the pantry, Valerie checked the timeline for the main course. The roasted lamb would be ready in 12 minutes, the vegetables in 8, the sauces already finished and waiting in their warmers. She had built in buffers for delays, accounted for Lorraine's interruptions, and ensured that no one on the staff would be asked to stay past the agreed schedule without compensation. She did this not out of rebellion, but out of principle. People who worked deserved to know when their work would end, and they deserved to be paid for every minute they gave. Lorraine appeared in the doorway, her silk dress catching the overhead light. "The lamb?" she said. "I hope it's not overdone. Andrew's guests expect quality." Valerie looked at her, saw the challenge in her eyes, and replied, "It will be perfect." Lorraine smiled, a thin line that did not reach her eyes, and walked away. Valerie's hands, steady all evening, trembled once, briefly before she steadied them again. The main course arrived at 7:30, each plate arranged with the precision of a painting. Slices of lamb, pink at the center, rested on a bed of roasted root vegetables, and the sauce pooled beside them in a crescent, dark and glossy. The guests praised the presentation, the flavor, the timing, and Lorraine accepted their compliments as if she had cooked the meal herself. Andrew said nothing, only watched as the servers moved between the table and the kitchen, silent and efficient, a choreography Valerie had refined over months. But the evening was not yet over. As dessert approached, Lorraine found a new target. She asked Valerie, in front of the entire table, whether the staff had remembered to polish the dessert forks. Valerie confirmed they had. Lorraine picked up a fork, held it to the light, and pointed to an imaginary smudge. "This won't do," she said, her voice carrying over the table. "Please have them repolished." Several guests turned to look, their faces curious, amused, or uncomfortable, depending on their temperament. Valerie took the fork without argument, returned to the kitchen, and examined it under the brightest light she could find. There was no smudge. She polished it anyway, carried it back to Lorraine, and placed it beside her plate. "Thank you," Lorraine said, her smile cold. Kayla, watching from across the table, leaned over and whispered something that made Lorraine laugh. Valerie returned to the kitchen and allowed herself 3 deep breaths before she resumed checking the timeline. Andrew stood then, cutting through the laughter, and murmured conversations with the sound of his glass tapping against a spoon. The room quieted. He did not raise his glass. Instead, he set it down and said, "I'd like to cancel the toast." The guests looked at one another, confused, waiting for the punchline. Lorraine's smile froze. Kayla's hand, halfway to her phone, stopped mid-reach. "This dinner," Andrew continued, "has a different purpose than you might expect. Over the past 6 months, I've been evaluating candidates to lead a new hospitality foundation, a social initiative focused on training workers in this sector, with fair labor practices at its core. Tonight was part of that evaluation. Some of you were here as potential board members, some were here as consultants, and all of you were here to be observed. The silence that followed was not the comfortable hush of anticipation. It was the silence of realization, of scripts being rewritten in real time." Lorraine's face went pale beneath her makeup. Kayla lowered her phone to her lap and sat very still. The venture capitalist from Silicon Valley leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, his expression unreadable. Andrew let the silence settle before he continued. "The central criterion for leadership in this foundation is simple: demonstrated respect for workers. Not performative respect, not theoretical respect, but the kind that shows up in actions, in policies, in how people treat those who serve them." He gestured toward the kitchen. "I'd like to invite my staff into the room so you can hear directly from the person who has been managing this household for the past year." The maitre d' opened the door, and Valerie stepped into the dining room, her hands empty, her posture straight. She did not look at Lorraine or Kayla. She looked at Andrew, who nodded once, and then she looked at the guests, who were no longer laughing. Andrew's voice, when he spoke again, carried a calm that belied the disruption he was causing. Valerie Brooks has been the house manager here for 12 months. In that time, she's implemented systems that have reduced costs, improved efficiency, and most importantly, protected the well-being of every person who works in this house. I'd like her to walk you through what she's done, because it's exactly the kind of thinking the foundation needs. Valerie felt the weight of every gaze in the room. She was used to being invisible, to moving through spaces without drawing attention, and now she stood in the center of a circle, exposed. But Andrew's nod was steady, and she understood that this moment had been designed, that she had been brought here not to be humiliated, but to be heard. She cleared her throat and began. I manage scheduling, inventory, and team coordination, she said. Her voice was quieter than she intended, so she steadied it and continued. When I started here, the staff worked inconsistent hours. People were asked to stay late without notice, and overtime was rarely compensated. Turnover was high because no one knew if they'd be able to keep their second job or pick up their kids from school. She paused, gauging the room. Lorraine's face was stone. Kayla's eyes darted to her phone, then back to Valerie, as if calculating whether this was something she could post about or something she needed to bury. The other guests watched with varying degrees of interest, some leaning forward, others retreating into their chairs. I created a fixed schedule divided by actual priorities, Valerie continued. 3 people can comfortably cover an event like this one without exceeding their contracted hours. I track every shift, and at the end of each night, the team signs a transparency sheet confirming their time. If someone goes over, they're either compensated or given equivalent time off. It's not complicated. It's just clear. Andrew gestured toward a portfolio resting on the sideboard. Valerie also restructured our purchasing. We were overspending on name brand suppliers when local vendors offered equal or better quality at lower cost. She researched, compared, and switched, and we've saved 18% on monthly expenses without compromising the guest experience. He opened the portfolio and passed around printouts showing side-by-side invoices, before and after energy bills, and a graph tracking reduced staff turnover. Valerie continued, her confidence building as she moved through the facts. I also changed how we handle mistakes. Instead of punishing errors, I run weekly service simulations, short, focused exercises where the team practices under pressure. Breakage has dropped by 40%. Rework is almost non-existent. And morale is higher because people know they're being trained, not blamed. The venture capitalist spoke for the first time. How do you quantify morale? His tone was skeptical, but not hostile. Valerie met his eyes. Retention rate. No one has quit in the past 6 months. Before I started, we were replacing someone every 5 weeks. Hiring and training costs dropped by 60%. He nodded slowly, his skepticism softening into something closer to curiosity. But Lorraine was not curious. She was calculating, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her jaw set. She had spent decades cultivating influence in her son's life, and she saw in this moment that influence slipping away. Kayla, too, seemed to realize the evening had shifted into territory she had not anticipated, where her usual tools, charm, visibility, the performance of authority, would not help her. Andrew looked around the table. Tonight's behavior has been instructive. I've seen how some of you treat people you believe have no power, and I've seen how Valerie responds under pressure, with clarity, with dignity, and with a system that works. He turned to Valerie. Thank you. You can return to the kitchen if you'd like, or you can stay for this next part. It's your choice. Valerie hesitated, then said, I'll stay. She moved to stand near the sideboard, not quite at the table, not quite outside it. Andrew nodded, and Lorraine's expression hardened into something close to fury. Lorraine recovered her voice first, though it carried a brittleness it had not held before. All of this is very impressive, Andrew, but I think we need to talk about context. Valerie is competent, certainly, but she's also inflexible. A few weeks ago, I offered her a promotion, quiet, internal, nothing official, to oversee the team's days off. She declined. It suggests a certain limited availability. The accusation hung in the air, calculated to sound reasonable. A promotion declined could be read as ambition lacking, as someone not willing to go the extra mile. Valerie's stomach tightened. She had expected Lorraine to push back, but not this way, not with a distortion wrapped in just enough truth to sound credible. Andrew did not look at Lorraine. He looked at Valerie. "Is that accurate?" Valerie met his gaze and nodded. "It is. Mrs. Sterling asked if I would manage scheduling for the team's vacation days without additional pay and without hiring support staff. I declined in writing and explained why. Taking on that responsibility would have required me to work unpaid hours, and it would have created pressure to approve or deny time off based on household needs rather than fairness." Lorraine's smile thinned. "It was a gesture of trust. You saw it as an insult." Valerie shook her head. "I saw it as a risk. If the team's time off depends on one person's informal approval, it opens the door to manipulation. It normalizes extensions of shifts without documentation. I've seen it happen in other households, and I won't participate in it." Kayla, sensing an opening, leaned forward. "I think what Mrs. Sterling is saying is that sometimes flexibility matters more than rigidity. Valerie's insistence on signature sheets and records, it slows things down. It creates friction. In my work, I've learned that the best teams flow. They don't get bogged down in paperwork." Andrew's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted. "Flow," he repeated, his tone neutral. "Can you define that?" Kayla blinked. It's when people work together, without bureaucracy getting in the way, when trust replaces rules." Andrew nodded slowly. "And what happens when that trust is misplaced? When someone works an extra hour because they trust their manager will compensate them, and the manager forgets, or doesn't forget but chooses not to?" Kayla opened her mouth, then closed it. Lorraine interjected, her voice sharper now. "You're twisting this, Andrew. The point is that Valerie, for all her competence, lacks the kind of collaborative spirit a foundation would need. She's a rule follower, not a leader." Andrew walked to the sideboard and picked up a second portfolio, this one thicker than the first. "I asked our compliance consultant to conduct an internal audit over the past quarter. The report was finalized yesterday." He opened it and began reading aloud. "Critical finding. At 3 events organized by partners recommended by Lorraine Sterling, staff were asked to extend their shifts informally, without reporting the hours to payroll. The practice was identified because Valerie Brooks' signature policy flagged discrepancies between scheduled and actual hours." Lorraine's face went white. Andrew continued, "The audit also found that this practice, if unchecked, would have exposed the household to a significant labor lawsuit. Valerie's refusal to oversee time off without formal structure wasn't insubordination, it was risk awareness." He closed the portfolio and looked at his mother. "She protected this household. You were putting it at risk." The silence that followed was different from before. It was not the silence of curiosity or discomfort. It was the silence of collapse, of structures falling. Lorraine sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Kayla looked down at her lap, her phone dark and useless. The other guests watched with the cautious attention people reserve for accidents they are relieved not to be part of. Andrew set the portfolio down and returned to his seat. "I want to explain why this matters so much to me, why I've designed tonight this way." He paused, his hands resting on the table, his gaze moving across the faces watching him. 10 years ago, before I took over the family business, I spent 3 weeks working as a housekeeper in 3 of my own hotels, anonymously. I wanted to understand what we were asking of people. Lorraine's face shifted from white to gray. "You never told me." Andrew's voice remained calm. "I didn't tell anyone. I checked in under a false name, took a uniform, and made beds against a stopwatch. I dealt with guests who treated me like furniture. I felt the exhaustion of back-to-back shifts, and I learned that every efficiency we celebrated in the boardroom, faster turnover times, leaner staffing, higher occupancy rates, came at a cost someone else was paying. He stood and walked toward Valerie. That experience changed how I think about profitability. I started tracking turnover costs, training expenses, and lost productivity from burnout. I implemented policies to protect hours, raise wages, and provide benefits that actually cover people's needs. And for years, I've been looking for someone who could scale that work beyond my own properties, someone who understands that respect isn't a speech, it's a system. Andrew turned to face the room. When I read Valerie's written refusal of Lorraine's so-called promotion, I knew I'd found the right person. She saw the trap before anyone else did. She chose fairness over approval. And she documented it, which is exactly what a foundation built on transparency requires. Lorraine finally found her voice, though it shook. "You're humiliating me in front of our guests." Andrew shook his head. "I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference. The holding company's bylaws require board members to step down if their actions conflict with our integrity policies. The legal committee met this morning, and they're recommending your removal from the board." He paused. "It's not punitive. It's structural. You can't lead an organization when your actions undermine its principles." Lorraine stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd. I've given 30 years to this family's reputation." Andrew's voice remained steady. "And you've done it well. But reputation isn't the same as integrity. The foundation needs people who understand that." Lorraine looked around the table, perhaps hoping for support, but the guests avoided her eyes. She gathered her purse and left without another word, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. Kayla, still seated, cleared her throat. "I think I should clarify. I wasn't aware of the labor issues Mrs. Sterling's partners created. My comments about flexibility were meant in a general sense, not as a defense of anything unethical." Andrew looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Your post from earlier tonight is still live. The one where you call this household's operations chaotic. Would you like to take it down? Or should we let it stand as part of the record?" Kayla's hand moved to her phone. "I'll take it down." Andrew nodded. "And your participation in the foundation?" Kayla hesitated, then said, "I think it's best if I step back. This isn't the right fit for my brand." She stood, offered a tight smile to the remaining guests, and left, her heels clicking a quick retreat down the marble hallway. The room, once crowded with 20 people, now felt vast. The guests who remained were quiet, some finishing their wine, others staring at their plates. Andrew addressed them. "I'm not asking for a show of hands or a pledge of loyalty. I'm asking you to think about what you've seen tonight. If any of you want to participate in the foundation's work, we'll talk. But I need people who understand that justice isn't optional, even when it's inconvenient." Andrew returned to his seat and gestured for Valerie to join him at the table. She hesitated, aware that the space had been reserved for guests, for people who belonged in rooms like this. But Andrew's gesture was insistent, and she moved forward, taking the empty chair beside him. The remaining guests watched, some with curiosity, others with the slow recalibration of people adjusting to a new reality. "I owe Valerie an apology," Andrew said, looking at her rather than the room. "I put you in a situation tonight that wasn't fair. You didn't know you were being evaluated in front of an audience. I could have told you in private, could have spared you the performance aspect of this, but I needed the board candidates and the consultants to see how you respond under pressure, because that's what the foundation's director will face every day." Valerie's voice, when she spoke, was quiet but steady. "I would have preferred to know, but I understand why you did it." Andrew nodded. "I want to offer you a formal position as the executive director of the Sterling Hospitality Foundation. You'd have full autonomy to implement the systems you've been testing here. You'd build your own team, set your own goals, and report to a board that includes rank-and-file workers, scholars, and community representatives. not just executives. Valerie felt her pulse quicken. What about the staff here? Who would manage them? Andrew had anticipated the question. I've already identified your replacement, someone you've been training for the past 4 months. She's ready. And the transition would be gradual. You'd have a month to hand over responsibilities, document your processes, and make sure no one is left scrambling. The offer was extraordinary, not because of the title or the salary, though both were far beyond what Valerie had imagined for herself, but because it recognized the work she had been doing as valuable, as scalable, as something worth building into an institution. Still, she did not answer immediately. She thought of her grandmother, of the clinic in Silver Lake, of the Friday medications that could not be missed. I have conditions, she said. Andrew leaned forward. Go ahead. Valerie took a breath. I need to stay near my grandmother. I can't relocate to an office downtown if it means I can't check on her between shifts. And I need part of my work to involve partnerships with healthcare providers so that workers' families can access the support they need. Andrew nodded. The Foundation's office will be in Culver City, 30 minutes from Echo Park, and healthcare access is already part of the mission. Your input will make it better. He extended his hand across the table. Do you need time to think about it? Valerie looked at his hand, then at his face. I need a week to organize the transition, to make sure Mia and the others don't lose the structures they've learned to rely on. Andrew smiled, the first genuine smile of the evening. A week? That's fair. Valerie shook his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm, the strength of his grip. It was the handshake of someone who had worked, not just managed, and she understood then why he had spent those 3 weeks in his own hotels, why he had needed to feel what his employees felt. The remaining guests began to leave, some offering congratulations, others simply nodding and slipping out into the night. The venture capitalist stopped on his way to the door. I'd like to talk to you about the foundation, he said to Andrew. Not as a board member, I don't think I'm qualified, but as a funder, I'm interested in supporting work like this. Andrew handed him a card. Call me next week. When the house was empty except for the staff cleaning the dining room, Andrew and Valerie stood together in the kitchen. The overhead lights were harsh after the soft glow of the chandeliers, but Valerie preferred them. They showed the truth of things, the scuffs on the floor, the grease on the stove, the exhaustion in the faces of the people who had worked all evening. You did well tonight, Andrew said. Valerie shook her head. I just told the truth. He smiled again. That's what I mean. The week that followed was not a celebration. It was work. Valerie arrived at the mansion each morning before dawn, as she always had, and spent her days writing manuals that translated the instincts she had developed into instructions someone else could follow. She documented the schedule rotations, the purchasing guidelines, the service simulations that had reduced errors. She created a contact list with notes on each vendor, each supplier, each repair service that had proven reliable. Mia, the young server who had spilled the sauce, was promoted to assistant manager. She was nervous about the responsibility, afraid she would make mistakes, but Valerie walked her through the systems patiently, showing her how to track hours, how to flag discrepancies, how to say no when a request crossed a line. You don't need to be perfect, Valerie told her. You need to be fair, and you need to document everything, so if someone questions you, you have proof. Andrew visited the kitchen each afternoon, not to supervise, but to observe. He wanted to understand how Valerie transferred knowledge, how she built trust with a team that had learned to expect betrayal or indifference from management. On the third day, he asked her a question that had clearly been on his mind. Do you think the foundation can work, not just here, but out there in hotels and restaurants where the owners don't care? Valerie considered the question. It can work if we create consequences, if we build a certification system that rewards good practices and exposes bad ones, if we make it expensive to treat people poorly and profitable to treat them well. Andrew nodded. That's what I was hoping you'd say. By the end of the week, the transition was complete. Mia stood in the kitchen with the notebook Valerie had carried for a year, its pages filled with notes and schedules and reminders. "I'm going to mess this up," Mia said, her voice shaking. Valerie put a hand on her shoulder. "You're going to make mistakes. That's how you learn. But you won't mess it up, because you care about the people you're managing. That's the only qualification that really matters." On Friday, Valerie signed the contract to become the executive director of the Sterling Hospitality Foundation. The salary was enough to cover her grandmother's medications without counting coins, enough to move into a 2-bedroom apartment where her grandmother could have her own space again. The contract included health insurance, a retirement plan, and a clause that protected her from being fired without cause. It was the kind of stability she had never imagined for herself. That same day, the holding company's board met to finalize Lorraine's removal. She did not attend, having sent a lawyer in her place to negotiate terms. The lawyer asked for a public statement framing the departure as voluntary, a retirement after decades of service. The board agreed on the condition that Lorraine complete a governance training program focused on labor rights and social responsibility. It was not vindictive, it was structural, a requirement for anyone hoping to regain influence in the Sterling family's enterprises. Kayla, meanwhile, recalibrated her online presence. She archived the post about the chaotic household and began focusing on sustainable travel, partnering with companies that highlighted fair labor practices. It was not an immediate conversion, not a sudden moral awakening, but a recognition that her audience was changing, that performative luxury was losing its appeal, and that authenticity, even if calculated, was becoming the currency that mattered. The foundation opened its office in Culver City in late October in a building that had once been a textile factory. The walls were brick, the ceilings high, and the windows let in the kind of light that made people feel less trapped. Valerie hired a small team, a compliance officer, a training coordinator, and an outreach director who had worked for a decade in community organizing. Together, they built the first iteration of the certification program, a system that audited employers, tracked worker complaints, and published results publicly. Within 6 months, 12 hotels in the Los Angeles area had signed on, drawn by the promise of better retention rates and the threat of public exposure if they failed the audit. The results were measurable. Turnover dropped, costs fell, guest satisfaction rose. The foundation became a reference point, a model other cities began to study. Andrew and Valerie's relationship reshaped itself slowly. They had worked together before, but always with the formality of employer and employee. Now they were partners, equals in the foundation's mission, and the shift required adjustments. They met for coffee in the mornings, reviewed reports in the afternoons, and argued occasionally about strategy. Andrew wanted to expand quickly, to certify as many employers as possible. Valerie insisted on moving carefully, on ensuring the audits were rigorous and the standards high. "If we certify a hotel that turns out to be exploiting workers, we lose credibility," she said during one of their arguments. Andrew ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "And if we move too slowly, we lose momentum. People will forget why this matters." Valerie held his gaze. "They won't forget if we do it right. Trust the process." The tension between them was not hostile. It was the friction of two people who cared deeply about the same thing, but approached it from different angles. Over time, they learned to recognize when the other was right, when to push, and when to yield. The partnership became something neither of them had expected, a friendship built on respect, on shared exhaustion, on late nights spent drafting policies that mattered. They crossed paths at events, at community meetings, at training sessions where workers learned their rights and employers learned how to honor them. They traveled to New York together to present the foundation's model to a coalition of labor organizers. On the flight back, Valerie fell asleep against the window, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, and Andrew draped his jacket over her shoulders without waking her. When she woke, the jacket was still there, and he was reading a report, his glasses perched on his nose. "Thank you," she said, her voice groggy. He looked up and smiled. "You were cold." It was a small gesture, unremarkable, but it carried a weight they both felt. They were not just colleagues. They were something more, though neither had named it yet. The shift happened gradually, in moments too small to mark on a calendar. Andrew began calling her late at night, not about the foundation, but about nothing. Movies he'd watched, articles he'd read, a joke someone had told him that hadn't landed. Valerie found herself looking forward to those calls, to the sound of his voice when he was unguarded. She started texting him photos of her grandmother's garden, small blooms that appeared in the courtyard, evidence that life could persist even in neglected places. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, Andrew drove Valerie home instead of calling her a car. They sat in his truck outside her apartment, the engine off, the silence comfortable. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Valerie nodded. "When you first started at the mansion, did you think I was another entitled rich guy who didn't care about his staff?" Valerie hesitated, then laughed. "Yes, absolutely." Andrew laughed too, the sound unexpected and warm. "Fair. I probably was, at least in ways I didn't realize." He turned to look at her. "You changed that. You made me see what I'd been missing." Valerie met his eyes. "You were already looking. I just showed you where." They sat in silence for another moment, and then Andrew said, "I'd like to take you to dinner. Not a work dinner, a real dinner." Valerie's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Are you asking me on a date?" He grinned. "Yes? Is that allowed? Are there rules about dating your foundation partner?" Valerie considered. "Probably, but I've never been good at following rules." Their first date was at a small Italian restaurant in Silver Lake, the kind of place where the owner knew the regulars by name and the tables were so close you could hear your neighbors' conversations. Andrew wore jeans and a sweater, no suit, no tie, and Valerie wore a dress she had bought years ago and never had a reason to wear. They ordered pasta and wine, and for the first hour, they talked about everything except work. Andrew told her about his childhood, about the pressure to succeed in a family where success was measured in properties owned and deals closed. He told her about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from him, who smiled when he entered a room, but never asked how he was. Valerie told him about her grandmother, about the years they had spent together after her parents died, about the way her grandmother had taught her to measure ingredients by feel rather than by measuring cups, to trust her instincts even when the recipe said otherwise. "That's where I learned to manage," Valerie said. "From her. She never had a manual, never had training. She just figured it out because she had to." Andrew reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm glad she taught you, because you taught me." They dated quietly, without announcements or public displays. Valerie wanted to be sure, wanted to know that what they felt was real and not just the intensity of shared work. Andrew respected that, never pushing, never demanding more than she was ready to give. They went to movies in the middle of the afternoon, to museums on weekday mornings when the crowds were thin. They walked through Griffith Park and watched the sun set over the city, the lights beginning to flicker on in the valley below. The foundation grew. By the end of the first year, 30 hotels had been certified, and the model had spread to San Francisco and San Diego. Workers began to reach out, not just to report abuses, but to ask how they could implement the systems in their own workplaces. Valerie hired more staff, trained more auditors, and built a network of people who believed, as she did, that fairness was not optional. Andrew's hotels became showcases for the certification program. Guests began to choose his properties not despite the higher labor costs, but because of them, because they wanted to stay somewhere that treated people well. The reputation he had built over a decade solidified, and competitors began to notice. Some reached out, curious. Others dismissed it as a marketing gimmick, but the numbers didn't lie. Lower turnover, higher satisfaction, better profits. One evening, at the opening of a new training center funded by the foundation, Andrew and Valerie stood together at the front of the room, greeting students who had enrolled in the hospitality program. The students were a mix: young people just entering the workforce, older workers looking to transition into management, immigrants navigating a new industry. They shook hands, asked questions, and thanked Valerie and Andrew with a sincerity that reminded them why they had started this work. After the event, as they walked to the parking lot, Andrew stopped and turned to Valerie. "I think it's time we told people we're together. I don't want to hide it anymore." Valerie looked at him, saw the vulnerability in his face, and nodded. "Okay, let's tell them." The announcement was not a press release or a social media post. It was simply them, arriving together at events, holding hands when they walked through the foundation's office, sharing meals in restaurants without pretending to be just colleagues. The staff noticed first, of course, and their reactions ranged from quiet smiles to enthusiastic congratulations. Mia, now managing the mansion with confidence, pulled Valerie aside one afternoon and said, "I'm happy for you. You deserve this." Lorraine, having completed her governance training, reached out to Andrew with a letter. It was not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement. She wrote that she had spent decades believing that respect was something you earned through position, not something you gave freely. She wrote that the training had been humiliating at first, a punishment she resented, but that over time she had begun to understand why it mattered. She ended the letter by saying she hoped one day to contribute to the foundation's work if he would allow it. Andrew showed the letter to Valerie. "What do you think?" Valerie read it carefully, then handed it back. "I think people can change if they're willing to do the work, but she'll need to prove it." Andrew nodded. "Agreed." Kayla's career shifted. She became an advocate for ethical tourism, partnering with organizations that certified resorts and tour operators based on labor practices and environmental impact. She never reached out to Valerie or Andrew directly, but her posts began to reflect a different philosophy, one that acknowledged the people behind the experiences she documented. It was not a transformation driven by morality, at least not at first, but by the recognition that her audience cared about these things and that her relevance depended on evolving. The foundation's impact became measurable in ways that mattered: fewer complaints to labor boards, higher wages in certified workplaces, better access to health care for workers' families. Valerie's grandmother, now living in a 2-bedroom apartment with a view of the hills, received treatment at a clinic that partnered with the foundation, and her condition stabilized. She told Valerie one afternoon while they sat in the garden, "You did good, Mija. You did real good." Andrew proposed on a Tuesday evening, not at a restaurant or a scenic overlook, but in the foundation's office after a long meeting where they had argued about budget allocations. He knelt beside her desk, pulled a simple ring from his pocket, and said, "I don't want to do this work with anyone else. I don't want to do life with anyone else." Valerie, exhausted and ink-stained and happy, said yes without hesitation. The wedding was small, held in the courtyard of the training center, with the students and staff and workers who had become part of the foundation's community. There were no society columnists, no influencers filming every moment. There was just music and food and the kind of laughter that comes from people who know they are building something that will last. When the night ended and the guests had gone home, Andrew and Valerie stood together under the string lights, the city humming in the distance. "Do you ever regret it?" Valerie asked. "Turning that dinner into a test, exposing your mother in front of everyone?" Andrew considered the question. "No, because it was the only way to know who people really were, and it brought me to you." Valerie leaned against him, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "I used to think respect was something you had to beg for," she said, "but it's not. It's something you build, system by system, choice by choice." Andrew kissed the top of her head. "And we're building it, together." The foundation continued its work, expanding into new cities, certifying new employers, training new workers. The problems it addressed did not disappear. Injustice is stubborn, embedded in structures that resist change, but the foundation created a framework, a set of tools that people could use to fight back, And in a world where so much felt broken, that mattered. Years later, when Valerie stood in front of a congressional committee advocating for federal labor protections, she thought back to that night in Beverly Hills, to the moment when Andrew had canceled the toast and asked her to speak. She thought about Lorraine's cruelty, Kayla's performance, the guests who had watched and done nothing, and she thought about the choice she had made then and every day since to tell the truth and trust that it would be enough. It was, not because truth is always rewarded, but because she had built a life around it, a system that honored the people who worked, who served, who made the world function. And in the end, that was the only kind of victory that mattered. The kind you could measure in lives changed, in hours protected, in dignity restored. The night in Beverly Hills had not been a fairy tale. It had been a reckoning, quiet but absolute, and it had set in motion a series of choices that transformed not just Valerie's life, but the lives of everyone who worked in the places the foundation touched. Love had been part of it, yes, but so had justice and method and the stubborn belief that people deserved better than what they had been given. And in a mansion on a hill, in a city built on dreams and exploitation, that belief had taken root and grown, and nothing would ever be quite the same.